Every time you board an airplane, you're shown how to fasten your seatbelt, where the emergency exits are, and how to use your life vest. Most people barely pay attention, but almost nobody realizes those safety demonstrations exist in part because of one forgotten Pan American flight that crashed more than 70 years ago. For decades, the wreckage of that airplane remained hidden beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Investigators knew roughly where it had gone down, but no one had ever located it. Then, in 2026, after years of searching with modern sonar technology, researchers finally found it sitting nearly 2,000 feet below the surface off the coast of Puerto Rico. The discovery wasn't just about solving a decades-old mystery. It brought renewed attention to one of the most important accidents in aviation history, a crash that forever changed how airlines prepare passengers for emergencies. This is the story of Pan American Flight 526A. To understand why this flight mattered so much, you have to understand what Pan Am represented in 1952. Back then, Pan American World Airways wasn't just another airline, it was the airline. Flying on Pan Am meant luxury, prestige, and adventure. The airline connected continents, pioneered international travel, and introduced millions of people to destinations they had only dreamed about. Its pilots were among the most experienced in the world, its aircraft were considered some of the safest available, and passengers trusted the airline completely. Commercial aviation itself was still relatively young. Air travel was becoming increasingly popular, but many of the safety standards we take for granted today simply didn't exist. Passenger safety briefings were inconsistent, emergency demonstrations were often minimal or skipped entirely. Many travelers had never worn a life vest before and had no idea where emergency exits were located. Those shortcomings would soon become painfully clear. On April 11, 1952, Pan American Flight 526A departed San Juan, Puerto Rico, bound for New York City. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-4 named Clipper Endeavour, carrying 64 passengers and 5 crew members. The weather was favorable, and nothing seemed unusual as the airplane lifted off from Isla Grande Airport shortly after sunset. Only a few minutes into the climb, everything changed. One of the aircraft's 4 engines suddenly lost power. Engine failures weren't unheard of on piston-powered airliners, and experienced crews were trained to continue safely with one engine inoperative. The captain and crew immediately began working through emergency procedures. Then, things became much worse. A second engine also began losing power. Now, the aircraft was struggling to maintain altitude. With 2 engines no longer producing sufficient power, the DC-4 simply couldn't continue climbing away from Puerto Rico. The crew had only moments to decide what to do. Returning to the airport wasn't possible. Trying to continue toward New York certainly wasn't possible. Their only realistic option was something every pilot hopes never to face. They would have to land on the ocean. Ditching a large passenger aircraft is incredibly difficult. The airplane must touch the water at exactly the right speed and attitude. Too steep and it can break apart. Too fast and the impact becomes catastrophic. Catch a wingtip on the water and the aircraft can violently cartwheel. Even today, successful ditchings are exceptionally rare. In 1952, they were even less common. The captain calmly prepared both the aircraft and its passengers. As darkness settled over the Atlantic, the crew lined up for the emergency landing. Then came the impact. Against extraordinary odds, the captain pulled it off. The DC-4 struck the water remarkably intact. Unlike many aviation disasters, the landing itself was largely survivable. In fact, almost everyone aboard survived the initial impact. For a brief moment, it appeared that disaster had been avoided. But what happened next would prove far deadlier than the ditching itself. Within moments, seawater began rushing into the aircraft. The damaged airframe started sinking faster than anyone expected. Passengers suddenly found themselves trying to escape an airplane that was disappearing beneath them in darkness. Many had no idea where emergency exits were located. Some struggled to find or properly wear their life vests. Others became trapped as water rapidly filled the cabin. Panic spread quickly. The ocean was dark. The aircraft was sinking. People were trying desperately to help family members or fighting to stay afloat themselves. Although rescue boats and aircraft responded quickly, they arrived to a scene of chaos scattered across the water. Some survivors clung to floating wreckage, others floated in life vests. Many never made it out of the aircraft. By the end of the night, 52 of the 69 people aboard had lost their lives. What made the tragedy even more heartbreaking was that many of those victims had survived the ditching itself. They died during the evacuation. And investigators soon realized something deeply troubling. Many of those deaths might have been preventable. That realization would eventually change commercial aviation forever. When investigators began piecing together what had happened, one fact stood out almost immediately. The crash landing itself had been remarkably successful. The captain had managed something that few pilots ever accomplish. He put a 4-engine airliner down on the ocean without it breaking apart, giving nearly everyone on board a chance to survive. So why had 52 people still lost their lives? The answer wasn't the impact, it was everything that happened afterward. Survivors described a cabin that descended into confusion almost instantly. The aircraft began taking on water much faster than expected. As it settled lower into the ocean, passengers struggled to find the exits in the darkness. Some had difficulty locating their life vests. Others either didn't know how to put them on correctly or inflated them too early, making it harder to move through the cabin. The crew did everything they could under impossible circumstances, but there simply wasn't enough time. Rescue crews reached the area quickly, but the Atlantic Ocean doesn't wait for anyone. By the time help arrived, the aircraft had already disappeared beneath the surface, leaving survivors scattered across the water. The investigation also focused on the aircraft itself. Examiners determined that 2 engines had lost power shortly after takeoff. Investigators concluded that carburetor induction system icing had likely restricted airflow to the engines, causing a severe loss of power. While piston-powered aircraft had long been susceptible to carburetor icing, the event demonstrated just how quickly a routine flight could become an emergency. But the mechanical failure wasn't the story's biggest legacy. The real legacy was what investigators learned about passenger survival. Officials concluded that many passengers simply weren't prepared for an emergency evacuation over water. At the time, airlines were not required to provide the detailed pre-flight safety demonstrations we know today. Some flights offered only brief verbal instructions. Others provided almost no practical guidance at all. Following the investigation, regulators and airlines began introducing significant changes. Passengers were given clearer instructions before departure. Flight attendants began demonstrating how to fasten and use life vests. Emergency exits were explained more thoroughly. Safety cards became standardized and much easier to understand. Crews also received additional training on preparing passengers for emergency evacuations, particularly on flights operating over water. These improvements weren't introduced overnight, and no single accident created every modern safety procedure. But Pan Am Flight 526A became one of the defining events that pushed commercial aviation toward a much stronger safety culture. Today, every time a flight attendant points toward the exits or demonstrates a life vest, they're participating in procedures shaped by lessons learned from tragedies like this one. As the years passed, the crash gradually faded from public memory. The official investigation had been completed. The victims had been mourned. But one question remained unanswered. Where was the airplane? Search efforts in 1952 had been limited by the technology of the day. Investigators knew the general location where the DC-4 had gone down. But locating an aircraft nearly 2,000 feet below the ocean's surface was simply beyond what was possible at the time. For decades, Clipper Endeavour remained hidden. Then, more than 70 years later, a group of researchers decided to try again. The search was led by the Air/Sea Heritage Foundation in partnership with the marine exploration company Deep Sea Vision. Instead of relying on divers, they deployed autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with high-resolution side-scan sonar. The vehicles spent days systematically scanning the seabed off Puerto Rico. Then, in June 2026, they found something. The sonar images revealed the unmistakable outline of a large 4-engine aircraft resting on the ocean floor. Researchers compared the dimensions, location, and visible features with historical records. Everything matched. After 74 years, Pan American Flight 526A had finally been found. The aircraft sits roughly 2,000 feet below the surface, remarkably intact considering how long it has been underwater. For the families of those who died, the discovery brought a sense of closure that had been impossible for generations. For aviation historians, it confirmed the final resting place of one of the industry's most significant accidents. And for the rest of us, it serves as a reminder that aviation safety is written in lessons learned. Every checklist, every emergency procedure, every evacuation drill, every safety card tucked into the seat pocket, every briefing that passengers routinely ignore. None of those practices appeared by accident. They exist because investigators studied tragedies, identified what went wrong, and refused to let those lessons be forgotten. Pan Am Flight 526A wasn't the deadliest crash in aviation history. It wasn't the most famous. But its impact reaches almost every commercial flight operating today. For more than 7 decades, the aircraft lay silently on the ocean floor, hidden beneath thousands of feet of water. Now that it's finally been found, its story deserves to be remembered, not simply because the mystery has been solved, but because the legacy of that flight continues every time an airplane leaves the ground.